She married a blind man as a social experiment, and the whole town watched in disbelief. Before the cameras and before the tabloids, Evelyn Hart had walked into Magnolia Bistro one rainy Thursday night and froze when a busser said two words that landed like a stone in her chest. "You look different." Before we go on, tell us where you are watching from in the comments and stay until the end for a question we will ask you to rate this story on a scale of 0 to 10. Magnolia Bistro was not what the glossy investor decks promised. The low lamps threw warm amber over scarred wooden tables. The aroma of simmering tomato and browned butter curled from the open kitchen, and the hiss of olive oil in a pan sounded like a small, tired heartbeat. Evelyn had come as a guest and left with an answer she did not expect to get simply by listening. In that first scene, she heard the quiet exhaustion in Rosa the line cook's voice, saw the way Javier the waiter avoided meeting eyes, and noted how Calvin the manager clicked his pen and slid a time card across the register with a mechanical smile that did not reach his eyes. "You look different," the busser had said, and Evelyn realized the spreadsheet she loved had missed the human ledger. She decided, in the span of a breath and a sip of coffee that tasted faintly of burnt sugar, to become invisible on purpose. She would marry a blind man publicly as a social experiment to expose privilege and test the community's reaction, and then she would slip in under the radar in a disguise to see what had corroded her bistro from the inside. The promise was blunt and dangerous. She would learn the truth, and if needed, she would fix it. Evelyn had the money, the power, and the apron in the back of her walk-in closet. She had never been so afraid. The scene closed with a short exchange that set everything in motion. "You sure about this?" said Priya, her assistant, voice low and practical. "I am," Evelyn answered, and she paused to fold the napkin on her lap twice, as if folding the future. "Make no mistakes," Priya replied, laying a list on the table, and Evelyn nodded, tasting the coffee and the fear. The second scene opened with the bistro in full swing, plates clattering, the sound of orders called out over the pass, and Calvin dictating shifts with the exactness of a man balancing numbers he loved more than people. The atmosphere was tight, almost metallic. The oil on the stove smelled like late afternoons, the lemon on the fish bright as a slap, and the floor tiles felt cool under Evelyn's borrowed shoes. She watched Rosa season a risotto with the practiced flick of a wrist, watched Javier smooth his apron and offer a tentative smile to a regular who smelled like old paper and peppermint. Calvin moved among them with a ledger-like calm that hid an edge. At the pass he said, "Keep to your stations," and his voice carried a cold civility. Rosa snapped back without looking up. "I did 3 specials before you even rolled in," and the exchange created an electric smallness in the room. Later, Evelyn pretended to fumble a reservation book, and a server named Lillian, the part-time pastry chef who doubled as the front-of-house whisperer, said, "You okay, hun?" And Evelyn realized how thin the staff's patience had become. She found that the week's payroll was late, that tips had been pooled and siphoned into pockets, and that a supplier invoice from Maria at Heart to Air Produce had been redirected through a shell company for a mysterious convenience fee. She met Simon Reyes that night in a way the cameras did not see at first. He was a quiet man who read menus with his fingers, who described texture with metaphors, and who laughed like someone unafraid of small joys. Simon was blind, and he spoke of food the way a poet spoke of light. He could tell salt from sea breeze without seeing a grain. The dynamics between Simon and the staff were immediately revealing. Calvin frowned when Simon asked about a missing salt cellar and muttered, "We don't waste," and the comment landed like a judgment. The scene showed the bistro's choreography and introduced minor characters who would matter. Priya, Evelyn's assistant who guarded her schedule and sometimes her conscience, Rosa, the line cook with a bruise of early motherhood in her voice, Javier, the waiter who kept a ledger of customers' kindness, Lillian, the pastry maker who hid recipes in her pocket, Maria, the supplier who smelled of basil and strong coffee, and Mark Alvarez, the local food critic who wrote in a column the town read like scripture. Each name was a filament in a web Evelyn now wanted to examine up close. The tension was the slow kind that grew teeth over time, and Evelyn decided to act. When she made the decision to infiltrate the bistro, she did it in a small, intimate room with Priya and 2 suitcases. Simon had asked to marry her as part of a very public project he agreed to for reasons that were his own, and the marriage became the headline that allowed Evelyn to test societal reactions to wealth, disability, and empathy simultaneously. That same night, while the city lights smeared into the river, Evelyn told Priya, "I need you to make me invisible." And Priya looked at her like a surgeon asked to perform delicate work. "How do you mean?" Priya asked, and Evelyn laid out the plan in measured sentences. "We change my hair, my clothes, my manner, and you put me on the floor as an unpaid intern. Using the name Evelyn Hart was not an option. Please call me Evie or even Mrs. Hart if you must, but not as owner." Priya wrote names, then looked up and said, "This will get messy and people will be hurt." And Evelyn answered, "I know," and she set her jaw, tasting a memory of a childhood lecture where her father had told her, "Leaders listen first." "Give me a week to practice the apron," Priya said, handing Evelyn a second-hand apron that smelled faintly of garlic. The micro-actions mattered. The way Evelyn tied the apron strings, the way she practiced writing orders on a scrap of receipt paper, the way she rehearsed humility in the mirror, smiling with her mouth but not her eyes. The choice to wear an apron, to accept lower pay and a time card, to be part of the troupe that took orders for a salary rather than a dividend, meant she would feel the cold of real responsibility. She promised herself one rule: observe only, intervene only when there was clear harm. The stakes were set, and a public vow to Simon gave her cover. When Evelyn later signed a marriage certificate, she felt as if she was signing a warrant to test human nature. The first days on the job were both comic and instructive. Evelyn tripped over a mop bucket, spilled a tray of brigadeiros at a private table, and laughed the embarrassed laugh of someone used to polished stages. Javier said, "You all right there, lady?" and she made a joke about clumsy shoes. Training came slow and smelled of burnt sugar and lemon peels. Priya coached Evelyn on how to fold napkins quickly and where to store the aprons so they smelled of bread instead of old perfume. Her interactions with Simon were clumsy at first and tender in equal measure. Simon taught her to read labels by touch, to identify a basil leaf by vein and texture, and to understand that hospitality could be a conversation held without eyesight. In the kitchen, Evelyn listened to Rosa critique her risotto technique with a bluntness she had learned from years of rice that misbehaved. She said, "More stirring, less haste," and Evelyn repeated the motion until her arms ached in the soft way of honest labor. Dialogue in the kitchen lengthened into a rhythm. "Evie," said Rosa in a low, weary voice, "you're new." And Evelyn answered, "I'm trying to learn." And Rosa pinched her shoulder gently. "Not because you want to, because you have to." And that small exchange stitched Evelyn into a team she had never known. She learned the names of regulars, the exact bend of Mark Alvarez's mouth when he liked a dessert, the way Lillian hummed when she made a tart. Sensory detail crowded in. The sting of hot steam against an ear, the metallic tang of the serving tray, the soft papery feel of an old menu, the steady slap of a time card into the register. There were mistakes made public, blunders that earned tiny sarcastic jokes, and these moments of humility brought Evelyn closer to the people who would become the town's everyday storytellers. In the back of her mind, a small, insistent plan was forming. If she could win the staff's trust, she could gather the truth. After those early days, Evelyn began to notice systematic injustices and small cruelties calibrated to look like efficiency. Calvin, the manager, used warning slips as a power play, sliding a folded note across a server's station with a quiet, "I'm watching you" tone that made knees go weak. He docked hours with bureaucratic indifference and often misapplied time card entries so that overtime was invisible. One evening, he humiliated Javier in front of a dining room full of regulars, said, "You forgot Table 7's order for the 3rd time." And when Javier stammered, "I'm sorry, sir," the room turned in on itself like a watch closing. Calvin spoke in a small, contained voice, and his words were precise instruments. At a staff meeting, he said, "We have to tighten up." And when Rosa, voice flat, replied, "Tighten on us, not on food costs?" Calvin returned a stare and said, "We all make sacrifices," which read as, "You are replaceable." That was the pattern Evelyn had come to expose. She kept her notebook in her apron pocket and wrote down times, exchanges, and a growing list of names. She began to see margins added to receipts that vanished into unknown accounts, and noticed suppliers' deliveries arriving late because invoices were, she suspected, redirected. The injustice that pushed Evelyn from observation to action was small and vicious. A motherly cook who was denied a day off to attend a son's school play because the manager had scheduled a last-minute staff cut without compensation. Evelyn's internal promise hardened into a public obligation. It was at this point that the story stopped being an experiment and started to become a drama of hope. The bistro's regulars rallied when they felt a twinge of unfairness. Mark Alvarez wrote a column that praised Lillian's tart tatin and, in an offhand line, described the front of house as strained. The community began to murmur. Evelyn, still disguised as Evie, began to coach Rosa in secret, finding the dignity of teaching rather than telling. They practiced a new risotto recipe the way conspirators practiced a chorus, each spoonful a whispered strategy. It was also where the romantic thread tightened. Evelyn and Simon shared small confessions between orders. He said, "I accepted the marriage for a reason I could not say at first," and she answered, "Tell me anyway," and he touched the back of her hand under the table as if reading Braille. He told her he had been hurt by people who mistook her money for an empty heart, and she admitted that her childhood was a ledger of expectations. Their conversation extended, 10 exchanges long that night at least, each line a thumb smoothing an apron hem, a breath held and released, laughter swallowed and then allowed. The connection was complicated and real, and it made Evelyn question how much of her action was charity and how much was wanting to be seen as human. The kitchen smelled of caramelizing onions and citrus, the bar clinked with ice, and somewhere a door banged shut like punctuation. This section of the story built character and made the reader care about both the experiment's ethics and its tender outcomes. Now, for a moment, we want to hear from you. If you have felt the tension between authority and empathy before, pause and share your thought in the comments below. Do you think there is a real difference between being a boss and being a leader? On a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is no difference at all, and 10 means enormous difference. And tell us the city you are watching from, because these stories travel better when we know where they landed. Your comments help other viewers find this conversation and help us decide what stories to bring next. We read every response, and we shape future episodes around what moves our audience. Leave your number, your little story about a boss who became a leader or vice versa, and know that your experience matters in this community we are building together. Now, back to Evelyn's decision, because what she chose next would force every secret onto the table and would make the town pick sides. The middle of the narrative led to the escalation. Evelyn entered a regional competition that the bistro had always thought beneath it, the Riverlands Culinary Contest. She did so in secret, signing the dish in Rosa's name and entering a recipe that was half her grandmother's memory and half a technique she had practiced under Lillian's patient hands. The training montage was long and intimate. They practiced plating until the rim of a bowl was perfect, practiced the timing of garlic and lemon until the kitchen smelled of citrus like a summer memory, and practiced responses to judges' questions until confidence sat in their chests like an extra coat. The backstory of Evelyn herself revealed why the experiment mattered in an intimate series of recollections. She had grown up in a house where affection came packaged with achievement, where dinners were staged as exhibits, and her father's approval always arrived attached to a ledger he kept in his head. As a child, she counted votes in the family's investments and learned to value numbers over names. Her mother, a woman named Margaret, who loved magnolia trees and learned to bake brioche from a French neighbor, had died when Evelyn was young, leaving a scent of lemon and a wrapped recipe book in the pantry that Evelyn kept hidden under dresses. Her first successes at 25 were adrenaline and contracts, but they were also a substitute for a simpler joy she had seen in others who cooked for love. She had married wealth to safety and had never known what it felt like to be seen without profit. The experiment was born of that hunger to know whether people responded to her money or to her. Simon's presence complicated everything. For him, backstory read differently. He had not been born blind. An illness in his 20s had taken his sight, and with it had demanded he learned new economies of trust. He learned to read investment in tone and rhythm, to assess character by handshakes and the warmth of calls, and to love without visual proof. The dual backstories made the stakes personal. She wanted to be loved for who she was, and he wanted to know that love could survive the exposure of a trick. These memories were woven into meals. When Evelyn taught Rosa a finishing technique, she also told a story about a childhood tart. And Priya, overhearing, left a tray of brigadeiros like a peace offering. That backstory section was the private room of the script, 3 compact paragraphs in which the past was a map to the present, and it turned human ledger into human heart. As the contest day approached, the pressure became almost palpable. They rehearsed technical descriptions and plating processes with a discipline that smelled like lemon zest and hot pans. The rules of the contest required a precise description of each recipe in 300 words, and the team rehearsed until each word fit the plate like a garnish. The competition itself unfolded with long, authoritative judging exchanges. The head judge, a stern woman named Chef Antonelli, asked Rosa, "Tell me about your risotto," and Rosa answered in a steady voice that described rice variety, stock reduction, and the timing of a final fold. They traded 10 to 15 lines in a scene that was equal parts technique and confession. The sensory description of that scene was layered. The rice-like grain flickered in the light. Steam carried the smell of butter and truffle. Forks clicked like distant metronomes, and the crowd's breath was a tide. The win felt like a small miracle. When Lillian hugged Rosa and Evie, the kitchen tasted of victory and sweat. The applause felt like a warm bread crust breaking. Mark Alvarez wrote a column that did not just praise the food, it praised the team and mentioned the name Magnolia Bistro in a way that opened doors. Evelyn, still in disguise, felt something shift in her chest. She had not anticipated the rise of public affection that did not immediately unmask her. That victory was a loud note in a soft song. Then everything unraveled. A local reporter named Hannah Cole, who had been covering social curiosities for the River Post, smelled a story in the oddity of Evelyn's public marriage to Simon. Hannah was sharp and methodical, and she had a friend who worked at the courthouse. She obtained the marriage license, found discrepancies in a string of invoices that traced back to a shadow company, and started to ask questions that moved from curiosity to accusation. The moment of revelation was sudden and dramatic. Hannah published a piece that included an interview clip of Simon explaining why he had agreed to the experiment. And in the same article, she implied that Evelyn had used the marriage for PR while not revealing the intimate work Evelyn had done on the floor. The dining room erupted when a patron read the article aloud. Someone at a table said, "She married him for clicks," and voices multiplied. Simon felt betrayed by implication and walked out, his cane tapping like a metronome that counted down faith. The confrontation with Calvin followed in a sequence that would become one of the story's major tensions. Calvin accused Evie of deception and said, "You used us to clean up your mess." And Evelyn replied, "No, I was trying to understand." And their argument grew until Lillian stepped between them and slapped the table with a wooden spoon to demand silence. That public exposure cracked open trust like a dropped plate. The moment was a long 500 to 600 character storm of feeling where Simon's hurt, Evelyn's shame, and the staff's anger collided. People shouted, plates scraped, and the bistro that had been a refuge for a fragile community became an open wound. In the chaos that followed, Evelyn revealed her identity reluctantly to stop the erosion of trust. She held a short, staccato press conference in which she said, "I wore an apron to listen," and the sentence arrived with the weight of a person trying to be held accountable. There followed an ugly stretch of accusation and counter-argument. Some regulars felt deceived, some staff felt vindicated that their complaints were finally exposed, and Simon felt as if the marriage certificate had been used like a stage prop. The repair process required evidence and procedure. Evelyn worked with Priya and with Mark Alvarez to gather signed time cards, invoices, witness statements from Maria the supplier, and video footage of Calvin directing the schedule in a way that showed intentional unfairness. The procedural description of this investigation read like a municipal audit. They cataloged documents, time-stamped deliveries, cross-referenced bank deposits, and prepared a binder that would be presented at a chamber meeting. This technical recounting of steps took about 300 characters to describe, and provided a clear forensic backbone to the emotional narrative. With this evidence, they called a meeting at City Hall and presented the case to the Restaurant Association and to Mayor Thompson. The association convened, they reviewed the ledger, and the outcome was decisive. Calvin was removed from his position. The association documented multiple violations in a 50-page report, and the town applauded a form of accountability that had been rare. In that decisive meeting, there were 3 moments of highest tension that each: first, the moment when Calvin realized the binder contained his annotations and his face tightened like a fist. Second, the time when Simon, hearing the evidence but not the tone, felt blindsided and whispered, "I don't know you," and his voice broke the room. Third, the instant when the staff voted to accept Evelyn's apology and to petition for new payroll oversight, a vote that felt like a small mercy after weeks of strain. Each of these tension segments included memory, decision, and an action that moved the story forward. The result was immediate. Calvin was fired. His last act, a tight smile that looked like a curtain closing. And the bistro breathed as if released from a held breath. The public narrative shifted from scandal to accountability, and the paper's headlines read more like a trial than a love story. Repair did not happen overnight. Evelyn funded a small salary back pay plan, instituted transparent time cards, and arranged for Lillian to lead a kitchen training program. There was a municipal mediation that required signatures, a memo of understanding with the Restaurant Association, and a formal reorganization plan described in concrete, procedural terms that ensured fairness. These measures included setting up a payroll audit with an independent accountant and a contract clause that prohibited diversion of supplier payments without board approval. The technicalities were dry and bureaucratic, but they mattered. They changed lives. Privately, Evelyn tried to rebuild her relationship with Simon, who had felt used by the experiment. Their conversations were slow and careful. He told her, "You gave them money and took their dignity." And she said, "I meant to give dignity back." And the exchange lasted through 10 small lines of apology, explanation, anger, and a tentative offering of trust. They negotiated not just the public optics of their marriage, but the private terms of what it meant to be partners. Lillian organized community dinners where the staff cooked and the town ate and talked, and these events began to redress the social ledger. The bistro reopened with a renovated sense of purpose and a sign above the door that read Magnolia Bistro, with a small handwritten note beneath it that said, "Open for second chances." The epilogue arrived in 3 parts that tracked time and change. 1 month later, the bistro had its first community dinner, and the room smelled of garlic and fennel. Maria had donated fresh produce at a discount, and the menu featured a repaired family recipe of Evelyn's that became a crowd favorite. The staff had an emergency fund set up, and Rosa's son finally had a place in a school play that she had not missed. The aprons smelled newly of yeast and cinnamon. The 1-month account was a close observation of recovery and made the point that small acts could rebuild trust. 3 months later, the Magnolia Bistro had applied for a small grant from the city to host culinary apprenticeships. Lillian's pastry program was full, and Javier was saving for a motorbike to deliver goods himself. Simon had taken a job running sensory workshops for a local community center, where he taught blindfolded tasting exercises that made people reconsider their assumptions. He and Evelyn had begun the slow, careful work of rebuilding intimacy, attending sessions with a counselor and practicing honesty in small doses. The 3-month snapshot showed measurable outcomes: increased payroll transparency, higher staff satisfaction scores, and a small uptick in reservations that said recovery could be sustainable. 6 months later, the transformation felt settled and hopeful. Magnolia Bistro reopened a refurbished side door that led to a small room where community meals were held. Profits were being split in a new way that rewarded tenure and skill rather than political favor. Evelyn and Simon had a private ceremony among friends where she presented him with a recipe book that he had helped annotate with tactile notes, and he presented her with a wooden spoon carved by Maria's husband as a symbol of partnership. They launched a food truck called Magnolia on the Move that brought risotto and brigadeiro to neighborhood fairs, and that allowed Rosa to start saving for her own place. The 6-month account showed a town that had forgiven and rebuilt, a management structure that had been overhauled, and a couple who had turned an experiment into an unexpected marriage of conviction. The epilogue total was long enough to show concrete changes and small pleasures, the sense that justice had become practical, and that love, when tested, could change how people run a business. The ending was not cinematic in a single neat moment. It was a series of small reconciliations, a new payroll ledger, a signed letter of apology framed on a wall, and Simon's workshops that taught people how to listen with more than their ears. In a final scene that felt like both a full stop and a comma, Evelyn stood at the pass and tasted a spoonful of risotto that Rosa slid to her, closed her eyes and said, "I did this for the team, not for you." And Evelyn smiled with a gratitude that had no ticker symbol. He, Simon, took her hand in the crowded room and said something small and exact: "I see you better now." And she laughed in the way people do when they are surprised to be known. The bistro's reopening was not a PR stunt. It was a rebuilt institution. The manager had been fired, training instituted, suppliers renegotiated, and a community that once bristled with suspicion now ate together again. If this story moved you, leave a rating and tell us whether you think Evelyn's experiment was ethical or reckless. And if you have ever seen a leader become human, share that memory below. Please subscribe for more stories that look like investigations and feel like heart. And remember that sometimes the most unbelievable endings are the ones earned by slow work rather than a single grand gesture.